Tēnei au, tēnei au. Tēnei au, tēnei au, ko te hōkai nei o taku tapu wai. Ko te hōkai nuku, ko te hōkai rangi, ko te hōkai nei o tō tipuna, a tū mātauenga. Taku tapu wai, ko taku tapu wai nui nā tāne nui a rangi. I pikitia ai te rangi tū hāhā, te tihi o māno no. I roko hina tu rā, ko i o te matua kore anake. Ka riro iho ko ngā kete o te wānanga. Ko te kete tuauri, ko te kete tuatea, ko te kete aronui. Ka tiritiri a ka papau a ki papatu wānuku. Ka puta te ira tangata ki te whai ao, ki te ao mārama. Whāno, whāno, haramai te toki, haumi e, hui e, tai ki e. Ko te mihi tuatahi ki te mātua nui e te rangi, nānei hanga te whenua, nānei hanga te rangi, nānei hanga i ngā mea katoa. He hōnori he kororia ki te atua, i tēnei pō. Ki ngā mana o te whenua nei o te runanga o Otago, tai noa, ki ngai tahu, ko tēnei te mihi, ko tēnei te mihi, ko tēnei te mihi. Ki te whare e tū nei, te whare o te whare wānanga o Otago, te whare o rātou te ihi, te wehi, te mataku, engari i tēnei rā he whare e tautoko hia ana i ngā kōrero whakahirahira o te ao katoa. Nō reira ki te whare e tū nei, tēnā koe hoki. Ki ngā mate o te wā, o te marama, o te tau. Ki ngā mate o mātou, o tira, ia koutou e mātakitaki ana mai. Kua tangihia, kua tukua, ki pōhutu kaua, o tira, ki hine nui te pō. Nō reira takoto, takoto, takoto mai rā. Tai nō kia tātou, te hunga ora, kia koutou katoa e mātakitaki mai a ipurangi, nau mai, hara mai, tauti mai ki tēnei kōrero whakahirahira kei te whare wānanga o Otago. Ka ko te ngākau ki te kitia koutou katoa te maha o ngā tangata e whakaata mai ki enei kōrero whakahirahira hei tautoko ana i enei kaupapa o te ao. Ko ena ku whakaro a ki mihi mo te pō nei, ka tai au inai nei ki te huri te rākau ki tō mātou kai whakahaere mo te pō nei. Engari, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.
Good evening. My name is Robert Patman, and I'm delighted to warmly welcome you to the return of the University of Otago's Winter Symposium Series after a 2-year break due to COVID-19. The annual series is an opportunity for academic thinkers to connect with the community and discuss the big issues that matter to New Zealanders. Tonight, we are beginning the Winter Symposium Series with a focus on the Putin regime's full-scale invasion of Ukraine and its consequences. But please note in your diaries that on the 27th of July, a week on from now, Professor Peter Crampton will be leading a University of Otago symposium session on another very important topic, namely an examination of Aotearoa's new health system, a band-aid or a life-saving surgery. So please make a note of that in your diaries. Now, before proceeding further tonight, I have the privilege and the pleasure to introduce 2 panelists who will be contributing greatly to our proceedings this evening. Between them, they have tremendous expertise on Russia and the Ukraine and will hopefully help us demystify an event, that is the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that has severely shaken the security architecture of Europe and sent economic and diplomatic shockwaves around the world. Our guest panelist is Professor Natalia Chaban from the Department of Media and Communication at the University of Canterbury. Natalia focuses her interdisciplinary research on cognitive and semiotic aspects of political and media discourses within the context of the EU and international relations. I should add, Natalia is a twice awarded Jean Monnet Chair, Jean Monnet Chair, also President of the Ukrainian Studies Association of Australia and New Zealand, co-editor of the peer-reviewed Australian New Zealand journal of European Studies. In addition, I also have the pleasure of introducing Associate Professor Jim Headley from the Politics Program at the University of Otago. Jim specializes in Russian foreign policy, the European Union, nationalism, and ethnic conflict. He is the author of the highly regarded book, Russia and the Balkans, Foreign Policy from Yeltsin to Putin, published by Hearst and Columbia University Press, and co-editor of Public Participation in Foreign Policy, published by Palgrave Macmillan, 2012. Now, for the next 5 minutes, I'd just like to set the scene for Jim and Natalia to take up some of the issues which have been occasioned by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. President Putin's decision on the 24th of February 2022 to launch what he called a special military operation against neighboring Ukraine constituted the greatest use of force in Europe since 1945 by one state against another. The conflict has now been going on for nearly 5 months, and the number of civilian and military casualties has been very high. Reliable figures are hard to come by, but the UN has estimated that Ukraine has lost more than 5,000 civilians since the invasion. Military casualties are also high. It's widely believed that Russia has lost more than 20,000 soldiers on the battlefield, while Ukraine's military losses are estimated around 15,000. But Kiev's military strengths have risen more sharply with military deaths have risen more sharply with the intensification of recent fighting in the eastern part of the country. To date, the conflict in Ukraine seems to have been characterized by 2 distinct phases. Phase 1 consisted of Putin's army trying to overwhelm Ukraine and decapitate the Zelensky government in a matter of 4 or 5 days. That blitzkrieg effort failed due to Ukraine's staunch defense and the surprisingly ineffective military performance of Russia's mix of professional and consummate troops. Phase 2 of the conflict, which is the current phase of the conflict, is one where the Putin government has been forced to focus and consolidate its military efforts on the Donbass-Luhansk front in the eastern part of the country. It should be added that conflict between Putin's regime and the Ukraine first erupted in March 2014 after Putin's Russia annexed Crimea and then intervened in the Donbass region of eastern Ukraine to support armed separatists. Putin's justification for authorizing the special military operation in February of this year was that he felt he had, quote, no choice, unquote, after diplomatic efforts to solve what he said was a major security problem in the Ukraine had failed. Mr. Putin made 2 key diplomatic demands. He demanded that NATO membership for Ukraine must be permanently ruled out, and that NATO should pull back from Eastern Europe to a position that it occupied before the enlargement of NATO after 1997. The Biden administration and NATO leaders rejected Mr. Putin's demands. It is clear that the Putin regime's invasion of Ukraine was a flagrant violation of the UN Charter. It confirmed what's apparently been evident for much of the post-Cold War period. The UN Security Council is no longer fit for purpose. It's also worth highlighting that the Jacinda Ardern government believes it has a big stake in helping Ukraine defeat Mr. Putin's assertiveness. Since March, the New Zealand government has extended a multifaceted aid package to Ukraine worth more than 38 million New Zealand dollars. So if Putin's Ukraine invasion has been a defining moment for the international order in the 21st century, how do we explain this rapid sequence of events and what do they mean? It gives me great pleasure now to call on Jim Headley, and Jim going to speak for about 10 minutes. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Robert, and kia ora koutou. Really, I'm going to focus on how we might attempt to explain Putin's aggression against Ukraine. It seems a while ago now, but all of us, even those of us who have studied this and have spent many years writing about Russian foreign policy, had a very severe sense of shock on the 24th of February. despite Russian buildup of troops and the past aggressions by the Russian regime. And this shock, I think, was due partly to the scale of it, which Robert's mentioned. And also, I think, the immediate realization that there was no way back, no obvious potential peaceful settlement, which I think remains the case. What I'm interested in covering here, as we're limited in time, is beyond Putin's own spurious justifications, whether we can look back and see that in some ways it can be explained in terms of our understanding of Russian foreign policy. And I would say that it results partly from an intersection of developments in domestic Russian politics and ideology, in particularly Putin's development of thinking about the nation, and a broader and more widespread development in Russian foreign policy thinking. So when Putin returned to power in 2012 as president, there were protests about the way this had been manufactured. And Putin was able to subdue these protests and then used his renewed power to consolidate what people have called a conservative turn in Russian politics, really resisting illiberalism, as he saw it, of the West and of those opponents of him, and seeing opponents in Russia as agents of the West. And the Maidan Revolution in Ukraine was portrayed within this framework and in fact further contributed to its development. During that period, Russia really turned its back on the European Union, and the new Ukrainian authorities were portrayed as lackeys of the EU and also of the US. I think also in Putin's mind, there was a sense of threat that if Ukraine successfully transitioned to a liberal democracy and particularly orientated towards the West with the EU and NATO, then this would be a threat to Putin's regime itself. So in some ways, Ukraine came to stand as a sort of outpost of the liberal West that Russia was now opposed to. But really quite contradictorily, we've seen that Putin has this narrative of Ukraine being a fascist state that needs denazification. The grounds for this outrageous claim were laid by exaggerating the role of Ukrainian nationalists in Ukrainian politics and also in military activities since 2014, but also by belittling the idea of Ukrainian separate nationhood. Putin's nationalism is actually often contradictory, but in an article last July, he laid out a thesis denying that there is a separate Ukrainian nation separate from the Russian one. Any Ukrainian nation building efforts are therefore presented as extreme nationalism that threatens Russians in Ukraine and the wider Russian nation. It's worth noting that the rhetoric about denazification also fits a longer standing central plank of Putin's nationalism, which is the mythology of the Great Patriotic War, the victory in the Second World War. So he is now selling the invasion of Ukraine as a repeat of that. So the July article last year could be seen as laying the basis for the invasion. Indeed, I've recently met my former PhD supervisor, and he said that after reading that article last year, he was convinced that Putin was going to try and crush Ukraine, and simply he regrets the fact he didn't write an article about it at the time. Putin repeated many of the claims of that article in his rambling addresses at the start of the invasion, directed both at foreign audiences, but particularly at Russian audience. I think it's hard to tell how much Putin believes in this narrative, but I do think he has convinced himself. And we can also point to other explanations focusing on Putin as an individual, that he's been in power too long and is too isolated. Some people remark on his KGB background and that he's now trying to reverse the breakup of the Soviet Union, like the coup plotters in August 1991, trying to prevent it, including the head of the KGB then. And some of this may be true, but I think to understand the invasion, we also need to realize that it fits into a wider and more long-standing thinking about foreign policy within the Moscow elite. After the breakup of the Soviet Union, there was a brief period when the Russian leadership under President Yeltsin pursued what analysts called a liberal westernizing foreign policy. Russia was supposed to be transitioning rapidly to a liberal democracy, and as such would be a natural ally of liberal democratic states of the West. For a number of reasons, including domestic challenges, by the mid-1990s, there'd been a major shift away from this foreign policy approach. The dominant approach from then on has been what international relations scholars call a realist approach, one which claims that all states have their own national interests, that those may conflict with each other, and that every state needs to stand up for its interests by any means possible. And particularly a great power such as Russia, which may include consolidating a sphere of influence, in this case in the former Soviet space. The other thing worth noting is that actions by other states or organizations are interpreted within this framework, so that NATO enlargement, for example, is interpreted as a direct threat against Russian interests and also security. When this approach came in, it was known as pragmatic realism because the leadership, still then Yeltsin actually, realized that Russia was weak and isolated. But Putin, when he came to power in 1999-2000, focused on making Russia strong again, on rebuilding Russia's economy, particularly through energy exports and with the rise in prices of energy exports, and the Russian military, and demonstrating a willingness to use force, first in Chechnya and Russia itself, then Georgia, then Ukraine in 2014, in Syria, and now again in Ukraine. So I think although the scale of the current invasion is different and the violation of international law and norms more blatant, we can still position it within a developing evolution of Russian foreign policy and Putin's own thinking. But I think that is not to excuse it. To explain is not to excuse, and nor is it necessarily to blame the West, or in fact, I certainly would say not to blame the West for the invasion through antagonizing Russia. Nor is it to argue that it was inevitable. Even realists, including in Moscow, may well disagree about whether this actually is in Russia's national interests or real interests. But in retrospect, I think positioning it in this wider context and historical evolution does perhaps make the invasion a bit less surprising, if nevertheless still shocking.
Thank you very much, Jim. Natalia, have you got any questions for Jim or comments that you may have?
Well, thank you, Robert. Thank you, Jim. That was very enlightening and very interesting opening to our discussion. And since you're talking about foreign policy, my question is, while the narratives were introduced and goals of realpolitik were laid out, would you agree that eventually that the goals were not achieved? NATO has become stronger and closer to the Russian Federation. Ukraine has solidified its nationhood. Even the regions, those regions who speak Russian, predominantly in the east of Ukraine, are now more pro-Ukrainian than they used to be. And the project of the Russian world, Ruski Mir, of sort of appealing to a bigger world, and specifically Russian-speaking bigger world, is probably in danger, or if probably it's already finished. So sort of what is the result? The foreign policy seems to be not achieving the goals it really wanted to achieve.
And I think that's one of the puzzles, because I think Putin previously was fairly pragmatic, fairly opportunistic, and this seems to go beyond that. So I do agree with that. I think partly this is where maybe individual explanations come in, this sort of idea that maybe he's after a legacy, maybe he kind of reached his limit. I like to sort of mention that in some ways he sort of almost seems to feel himself epitomizing Russia now. So he takes all of these sort of insults, which he sees Russia as having gone for as personal insults, and vice versa. So this might have pushed him forward, but I do agree actually. And that was, I suppose, part of my point at the end. And there's a wider context to this in the debate about how we interpret it, because realists in the United States, such as Mearsheimer, sort of take this at face value and say any Russian leader would have done this, and therefore the West shouldn't have alienated Russia and so on. I do think it is a serious miscalculation, and it does actually seem to kind of really kind of question the degree to which Putin is kind of calculating rationally these interests. I've actually participated in and observed similar sort of panels where hardcore realist international relations scholars have sort of said, well, this is totally in Russia's interests. Of course, they're going to try and kind of control the Black Sea. They're going to try and prevent NATO enlargement and things. But I think that's taking a very kind of narrow picture. I think, and it may actually well backfire back on Putin himself. Although I think there is that shared thinking among the broader elite, as I say, I don't think there's necessarily that strong support behind this, and certainly the way it may well kind of lead to disturbances within Russia. And as you say, actually the wider Russian mir, the wider Russian world. And also, where's it put Russia? We see today Putin making his first visit outside the former Soviet space since the start of it to Iran. But who's his friends now? Iran, China. For many Russians, they see themselves as European. And this is where sanctions and things are hitting kind of the middle classes that they're used to traveling to Europe. They see their identity in Europe. So in trying to kind of understand it, I think there is a kind of balancing between sort of saying this is partly the kind of natural outcome of this way of thinking, but also saying, well, in some ways, it doesn't really match that thinking because it seems to be against Russian interests.
Jim, could I ask you, just following up from Natalia's question, you laid out very nicely how Putin's incursion, full-scale incursion into Ukraine did not come out of the blue. It was part of a sort of, you know, growing assertiveness in foreign policy going back some time. But I just wondered, from your point of view, do you think there was any particular triggering factors internationally or nationally that made Mr. Putin quite confident? Because I agree with you, it seems on the basis of what we've seen, a horrific miscalculation. And yet, you know, why did he make this move in 2022, or why didn't he make it in 2018, for example? So I just wondered if you, from your point of view as a Russian specialist, was there any factors that you think really loomed large here?
Well, no, not really. I mean, there was still talk about, you know, there was kind of moves towards maybe Ukraine firming up its position, certainly in relation to the EU and also NATO, including adjustments to the constitution. So it can be presented like that. But I do remember in the lead up to the invasion, as the troops were building on the border and making the point, this is going to be totally unprovoked because there's nothing sparked it. We were talking then about it being a crisis, but I almost refused to use the word because it was a totally manufactured crisis. So I would actually argue no. I think in the longer term, we can ask a bit more about whether there were kind of events which maybe pushed Russia more into this sort of thing. I recently had interesting discussions with colleagues overseas about this, and one of them sort of asking, was there a kind of single event that maybe the West did wrong, which kind of pushed it this way? And even there, it's hard to tell. I mean, Iraq, of course, was a full-scale invasion against sovereignty and so on. The Kosovo War, recognition of Kosovo, NATO enlargement as a whole. So we can kind of point to things which might have turned out differently. But even then, I have my doubts about whether that would have totally adjusted the overall trajectory of Russian foreign policy, and particularly a way of thinking that might have seen those as weaknesses if they hadn't happened. I mean, Iraq's different, but other cases as weaknesses, and therefore to be exploited by a leader such as Putin.
Yeah, I mean, we can return to this point. One thing that struck me when you were talking, Jim, that it seemed to Mr. Putin was very skeptical that the West could act decisively and in a coordinated fashion to this type of incursion that we've witnessed. But let's, Natalia, would you like to now present for us your talking points and your thoughts on the situation? We're looking forward to it.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Jim. Kia ora koutou. My name is Natalia Chaban, and I'm from the University of Canterbury. And I would like to say a big thank you to the organizers of the Winter Symposium at the University of Otago for inviting me to present with my wonderful colleagues, Jim and Robert. A great honor. And as a political communications person, I thought I will start with something which is very obvious to everyone. Any war attracts media attention. And as an expert in political communication, I will talk today more about information flows around the war of Russia against Ukraine but specifically highlight the fact that it's perhaps one of the first wars we witness in the environment of new media ecology. Newspapers were very keen to cover wars during 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. We think World War II and radio, Vietnam War and television, the Iraq War and satellite television, and now we have this war and it takes place in the new media ecology. So my big question of this presentation, what does it mean to how we conceive this war, how we imagine this war, and how we learn and know about this war? In the scholarship of political communication, new media ecology is seen sort of from two perspectives. Perspective number one is seen as a positive, specifically in democratic societies. Why? We build bridges, we're linked to communities we haven't linked before. Look, we are in this event, we are presenting, I'm from Christchurch, I have my colleagues in Dunedin, and we have big audience sitting in many different places. We built a community we would never be able to build without digital tools. But it's also about faster mobilization of citizens, of people in the country and around the world. But it's also about empowering citizens. It's also about emancipating citizens. Citizens have access to information, but also they can circumvent traditional channels and exert pressure on decision makers, on opinion makers on a scale not seen before. Think about public opinion around the world addressing their governments to help Ukraine. And then scholarship talks about some negative perspectives. Something called clicktivism, when people sort of click the like and move on. They think, I've reacted, I've contributed, but no real action. And we're all well aware of mis and disinformation, fake news, echo chambers, polarization. And since mis and disinformation are such a big part of any information flows around the war, it is what it is. This will be even bigger. And internet first was seen as impossible to be regulated by governments, but at the moment we know that it can be. There is centralization of power, and there is all sorts of ethical issues. So for me, what is interesting is to see the intersection of these perspectives with the three techniques used in any war communication. These are propaganda, psychological operations, as well as mis and disinformation. We'll see how we cover it given time available. The big stop for me first is propaganda. And propaganda, if we think into the definition of this event, Oxford Dictionary tells us it is a systematic scheme, concerted movement for the propagation of particular doctrine and practice, which suggests it actually needs time to develop. And when Jim was talking about this conservative turn, and if we think that Russian public didn't react to the war in Ukraine how we all thought normal people will react, reacting to casualties, reacting to atrocities, reacting to death. And I mean, war is a major tragic event. We may think about propaganda tactics used by the Russian government for decades, but definitely, as Jim mentioned, year 2012, definitely from that period in time. Here I'm turning to a colleague from Columbia University, Mark Lipovetsky, who is a scholar of literature and culture, and he proposes three points, which I think, Jim, will add to your argument you've just shared with us. You looked into political development. Now I'm talking about cultural ideological development. According to Lipovetsky, one of the first the features which got solidified since 2012 is the cult of suffering. It's sort of the idea that the people in the Russian Federation have this monopoly on suffering. They suffered a lot during World War II. They won during World War II. So sufferings of others in comparison, they just cannot compare. They're waning. The second one is the industry of nostalgia for everything Soviet. And it's very carefully cultivated, and it's also very diversified. Here we're talking about entertainment industry. Some shows started as pure entertainment, then became successful commercial, and then became imperial projects. For example, old songs about main issues. Think about eateries. which are serving dishes from the former Soviet Union, or TV series, dozens of them, which are presenting sort of the utopian picture of the late Soviet Union, beautiful faces, aesthetically beautiful, great songs. And that utopian feel of the USSR was so cultivated that even people born after the collapse of the USSR become nostalgic for the USSR. And for Lipovetsky, the third entry is the culture of cynicism. And it is inherited from the Soviet culture. It's the idea of, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, everybody steals, everybody lies. Why cannot I do it? And as such, it is okay to violate the rules. It's okay to violate the borders. And sort of these were culturally reproduced and circulated and propagated with a lot of intention. So if we think about why Russian people do not change their mind immediately, we should definitely think about the fact that certain developments were happening for at least a decade. But now looking at the Ukrainian side, I think that successes and propaganda by Ukrainian side are actually very much linked to the new media ecology and a very successful, innovative way of dealing with new media ecology. I will mention digital diplomacy by Volodymyr Zelensky, who reached to decision opinion makers, public around the world non-stop, where in day 147, and in these days, Zelensky never stopped talking to the world using Zoom, using digital tools. And this is something new. Diplomacy is supposed to be face-to-face, but a sort of new generation, new way of doing things. The Arestovich phenomenon, Alexei Arestovich is an advisor to the president of Ukraine. He appears on YouTube every day. He is doing interview with Mark Fagin in Russian language, gathering millions of members of audience every night. And this person is a former military, a scout. He's a blogger, an actor, a philosopher, and a psychologist. We're talking about the new generation of opinion makers, very savvy with digital tools, with incredible appeal. We could talk about how Ukrainian opinion makers and propagandists are working with the Russian opposition media. Again, very innovative ways of doing things, and again on digital channels. And we could talk even about cartoons. These are made by Russian cartoonists, and the recent cartoon about Masyanya, a very popular Russian Simpsons, about a woman called Masyanya, her family, her husband, her children, were transposed into a fictional city of St. Marienburg, St. Petersburg, attacked allegedly by China. And at the end of this cartoon, her family dies. It's about empathy, how people should feel empathy. I know I'm running out of time. I just wanted to say that we have psychological operations, and here, new media ecology offered, and specifically Ukrainian side, if you are interested, I can give more examples, a lot of tools to diversify, to micro-target, as well as to make their psychological operations more sophisticated. We're talking about stamps, about the Snake Island with a famous middle finger. We're talking about YouTube videos. We're talking about press conferences with the captives on social media. There are some counter efforts by the Russian Federation. For example, the babushka was the flag, the old lady was a flag. That was an attempt by the Russian Federation to provide a psychological operation to counterbalance the post, the stamp was the sort of greeting the Russian Navy ship. So that's again potentially for Q&A. And finally, my final point is about mis and disinformation. We sort of typically see mis and disinformation and online tools going together. My argument that actually online tools are helping to fight mis and disinformation, not lastly due to through the open source intelligence, when citizens are participating in collecting evidence and providing this evidence to experts who are then piecing it all together using the satellite imagery with the feed of the citizens, and then providing very detailed reports online where they debunk mis and disinformation about this war. Happy to answer more questions. It's a rich topic, but the intersections between new media, ecology, and information flows during the type of wars deserve much more attention and lots of questions, I hope.
Thank you, Natalia, for a really fascinating presentation. Jim, have you got any questions that...
Well, really just a comment and then maybe a bit of a question, but it's really fascinating. Today, by coincidence, I suppose, I was rereading an opinion piece by a Croatian writer from 1993. So I've written in 1993 with the wars in Yugoslavia, and it was called The Culture of Lies. And so that was that pre-internet period, and yet much of the content of what she was describing of the culture of lies, and particularly this kind of rewriting of history or using history. She had a quote from Kundera at the start saying that nobody wants to create the future, they want to get in power in order to write a different past. And so she was saying it was all about this kind of battle about the past, and we can see that again, but as you say, in a different kind of media environment. And in relation to the past, I thought it was very interesting, that kind of relationship to the Soviet Union, which Putin in some ways is quite ambiguous about. He was quite critical about the early Bolsheviks creating the nationalities policies, which created Ukraine and so on. But more generally, yeah, there's that kind of feeding into a nostalgia and so on, and almost kind of reviving some values. I mean, I was really, I suppose, interested, but slightly amused by this sort of idea of Russian suffering, which is a big cliche about Russia. But I think you're right, that it's also something which is there. And I think, as you say, it does tie to the conservative turn, because it's about, no, it's not about kind of, individuals getting comfortable ways of life and getting their commodities. That's not what life is about. So it's tied to this supposed turn to orthodoxy. And it can be very kind of useful. I think the irony is that in many ways, the suffering that many people in Russia would remember is the suffering of the 1990s and the economic chaos then, which of course led to Putin's popularity, but he's in danger of kind of throwing it back into, and whether he can continue to kind of garner support as he does so is questionable. Just in terms of that, I suppose about the 1990s, but also this harking back to the Soviet time, what do you think we're seeing in Russia different generations having different approaches because of growing up with different media environments and also just being born after the Soviet Union and so on? Do you think that that's a fissure that's going to develop or is already there?
Just a very quick comment about the culture of suffering or this sufferings, which actually suggest this particular way of thinking, suggests that the sanctions effects will be then interpreted within the narrative of sufferings. So if the West imposes sanctions and people live worse, again, that's one more time to suffer, and suffer is good. And so this is something to keep in mind if we're talking about sanctions later. Yes, interestingly enough, that because of the generational change, you would expect that certain groups of population be more affected by television, for example, and less by internet, and younger population to be more affected by the new media, because nobody canceled internet in Russia. People can look for information. They can look and check opinions and look around the world. If they don't want to look at Ukrainian opinion makers, they can look around the world. But it's very interesting because, as we already know, certain internet tools in Russia are not as we think they should work. We know recently was a big publication by Medusa in May 2022, and big investigation how Yandex.ru, which is a search engine for the Russian Federation, was claiming that they're neutral, they're not tweaking algorithms, everything's working honestly, and then it turned out that it actually was tweaked. And then they called them toxic acid, I think, if I'm not wrong. But where I see the generational conflict is actually not in Russia, but actually between Russia and Ukraine. And if we look at the age of Putin and his ministers and people who are in power, these are people in their 60s and 70s who had to survive in the 90s and potentially compromise in order to be successful, certain norms and values. While if you look at the Ukrainian leadership as well as opinion makers, they're all in their mid-40s. And this is sort of, I think there is a generational conflict between these two leadership styles, because this leadership style in Ukraine is like internet. It's more networked, it's more connected. It's about the system where everybody sort of depends on each other. Yeah, so that's my answer to the question about generation.
Thank you, Natalia. I've got a question as well, but I will, maybe we can discuss it later because we're beginning to get questions in from the audience. And I think it would be great to involve the audience. Now, the first question we've got for our panel, how do you think this war might play out? And what actions would you recommend to be taken to accelerate this? I ask this as the human cost is so great and rising. Jim, any thoughts on this?
I mean, I said in my introductory remarks that it's very difficult to see a way out. That was what was so shocking about it. I mean, there are different long-term scenarios that we could envisage. I mean, initially, I suppose Putin expected a quick kind of victory over Ukraine, although what that would have meant, I don't know. But we can maybe imagine that ultimately Ukrainian forces will drive Russian forces out of Ukraine, or I think it's less likely now that Russia will take control of all of Ukraine, but may continue to expand across the rest of Donbass and also across the southern coast. Perhaps the most likely scenario is a sort of long drawn out thing with skirmishes where there is some sort of consolidation of these front lines, and very hard to see how Russia can be driven out once it has consolidated. I saw today Zelensky appealing for more weapons, partly because he's saying that it needs to be before winter because that will give Russia a chance to consolidate. That's the kind of military scenario. Whether there's, I still see very little room. Again, Putin today was claiming that there was this peace deal sort of almost on the table in March and that they were nearly agreed on, and blaming Ukraine for backing down on it. But I just can't envisage what that could have been. I can't see how the Ukrainian authorities could allow anything that seemed to reward Russian aggression, or in fact other powers outside. And I can see any way that Putin could kind of back down in a way that was necessary to get Ukrainian agreement in a way that would be acceptable for him politically. And I think that still remains the case. It then raises the question, should outside powers try and push them towards some sort of compromise? But I don't think that's necessarily something that should be done because, as I say, I don't see any compromise possible which doesn't in some way reward Russian aggression.
Yes, I agree, Jim. And it's interesting, Mr. Medvedev said that a settlement had to be on Russia's terms if there was going to be a settlement, which seems quite assertive thing to say. Do you have any thoughts on this, Natalia, about how this conflict can be, if you like, played out and resolved as quickly as possible? How do you see it developing? We seem to have lost the
I think I will support Jim's argument about the fact that it's a dangerous development if external forces are pushing the two sides towards agreement, and especially because we have a precedent of Minsk agreements, and these Minsk agreements were short-term solutions which sort of led to less shooting, but didn't really solve the long-term, deeper problems. And that led to what we have in 2022. So there is, I think, a strong thinking that freezing the conflict as it is now on the borders of 24th of February or current borders where the occupied territories are sitting is not going to solve the problem long term. Of course, the saddest development is the fact that the advancement of Ukrainian troops with HIMARS and other weapons now in Ukraine, and they are, as we know, demolishing the warehouses where the weapons are kept. The reply from that is shooting at the cities, the shooting at the civilians, and that is the saddest development. The fact that we are observing casualties in new parts of Ukraine with more civilians dying, including children. And yeah, at this point, I don't think Ukraine will, looking at what is going on and what sort of sacrifices are made, that Ukraine will say, yeah, fine, let's sit down and let's agree and sign something. So I don't see a short-term solution at the moment.
I agree with your comments, Natalia, that there's been some pressure from commentators and scholars in a number of Western countries that there should be a sort of land for peace deal, whereby Russia was allowed to, if you like, retain some of the territory it's annexed. But I think Jim's made this very clear. That may be seen as a reward for aggression. And the problem with that deal is that it may not stick. It would not be acceptable to most people in Ukraine. And it also, what happens if Mr. Putin restarts hostilities 6 months after the deal? So it seems to me full of practical problems then.
What would be your assessment on the sort of American position at the moment?
Well, the American position, of course, it's fraught to domestic politics. I mean, Mr. Biden is not getting a lot of credit for supporting the Ukrainian government of Zelensky, but I still think the Biden approach, all things considered, is probably appropriate. And it's a steady escalation of support for the Ukrainian government. After all, the Ukrainian government and its army have proved themselves against what was considered a very formidable fighting force. And I think many people were surprised how well the Ukrainian army has performed. And Natalia just mentioned this new heavy weaponry arriving, the HIMARS, for example, these high mobility artillery rocket systems. They are beginning to have quite an impact. And the other thing is that much of the discussion about the war is based in the West and in Russia to some degree on the assumption this is going to be a long war. But Russia's economy is under strain. Yes, its oil prices have certainly gone up, and it's done nicely in terms of hard currency from that. But those sanctions are still biting. 500 companies have left Russia, and its overall economy is smaller than Italy. So I'm not sure how long Mr. Putin's got to fight this war. So I still think there is the potential for this. There's going to be a counteroffensive by Ukraine. We don't know when, but the situation is more fluid than I think that it probably seems at the moment. We'll just have to watch this space. Now, we've got several other questions. Hello from Slovakia. Do you think there's any possibility of other post-Soviet countries being attacked by the Russian army, even the ones that are NATO members? Maybe I could start with you, Jim.
Or maybe Natalia.
Well, let's go with Natalia. You're right. Let's reverse the order. Natalia.
Well, I think at this particular point, starting aggression against a NATO member is not a realistic scenario for the Russian Federation. We know that at the moment we have an operational pause because it's not enough rockets and the weapons to shoot due to the destruction of the warehouses. But we also know that on his trip to Iran, President Putin was asking his counterparts in Iran to provide the Russian army with the drones. So it is a risky development for the Russian army to start any aggression against any NATO state, big or small. I don't think the Russian army at the moment has any enough capacities and capabilities to sustain a conflict of that magnitude. Having said that, I think all countries, especially if we go closer to the Russian border, need to be vigilant and careful. And we see examples of Sweden and Finland getting into NATO after decades of being neutral. This development suggests that they take the situation in the region very seriously.
Jim,
I mean, I'd agree. I mean, I think the Russian army's been so hit and is so overstretched that it would just be inconceivable at the moment. There has been talk about maybe trying to link up to, and especially the expanded west on the Black Sea coast to Moldova, to Transnistria, or maybe kind of stirring things up in Republika Srpska in the Serbian part of Bosnia, for example. But I don't see either of them as being feasible at the moment or being likely, at least by the main Russian military. There may be mercenaries or whatever who might be kind of encouraged to stir things up. But again, it comes back, I think, to the longer term question of kind of rewarding anything that's seen as rewarding Russian aggression. I think most governments in the neighboring states, including the NATO members, are well aware that of the dangers of anything which might seem to reward Putin's aggression, and therefore kind of give a green light to to future aggression. I was reading a very interesting piece today, which was kind of comparing with the unwritten rules of the Cold War between the Soviets and the United States, and saying that in a sense it's stabilized to certain unwritten rules again this time, including, I mean, some of them have been made explicit, including by President Biden, that US and NATO will train Ukrainian troops, will supply weapons, but will not fight on the ground in Ukraine. And I think Putin realizes also that if Russia was to invade, certainly a NATO member state, then Article 5 would be activated and it would be suicidal. So there are those sort of unwritten rules. The article was more about whether it might kind of, something might happen almost by accident or out of Putin's control. But I don't think there would be a sort of planned invasion of Estonia or even a state like Moldova at the moment.
I think some of Mr. Putin's supporters in Moscow like to raise the spectre, many of them have, of attacking NATO. Some even directly threatened the United States recently, but I think this is bluff. And I think the other point that Jim's raised, though, is a really important one, that Russia may, in trying to accept, they haven't made much effort in this effort so far, but in accepting trying to intercept some of the infusion of arms from the Western countries. You know, war is an imprecise business. They may try to confine the operation to Ukraine, but if a Russian missile, a stray Russian missile went into a NATO country, that could cause some potential difficulty. So we can't say definitively the war won't spread, but if Putin retains tight political control of his military, then it seems unlikely. Now we've got another question here. The question is as follows: it is now plainly visible that our global distribution of all products, materials and resources is extremely fragile, and that we're at the end of cheap fossil fuel energy. How will New Zealand respond to this reality? Now, Natalia, could I ask you to respond to that? It's quite a long question, but it's an interesting one about the frailties of an interconnected, but as we've seen during this war, a potentially vulnerable global supply system.
Yes, this is probably one of the arguments why this war is not a faraway war in a faraway part of Europe with no relation to New Zealand. When the Crimean Peninsula was annexed in 2014, there was an outcry around the world, but very, very quickly the news has disappeared from the top of the charts, and people stopped talking about the Crimea, people stopped talking about the war in Donbass. It was one of the forgotten wars of Europe. So at the moment, we're also observing something similar in New Zealand. We do know that Western audiences, they have little patience for long and costly wars. And war in Ukraine was such a big news in the beginning, and all New Zealand news outlets, online, traditional media. And at the moment, it's no longer, it's still there, but it's not the front news. Look at The Guardian, the news about Ukraine go down, down, down. But I'm just back from Europe, and I've been to Italy and to Germany and to Sweden and Denmark. Ukraine is the concern number one on people's minds, and not only because of aggression and threat and danger, but specifically because prices went up on gas, the food is getting more expensive, the same in the United States. So suddenly people learned that apparently Ukraine provided grain for the rest of the world. Suddenly leaders from Southeast Asia are coming to Ukraine to talk to Ukrainian president because they're concerned their people will starve if the war will continue. So it's not only about New Zealand, the war is affecting the whole globe, and we know about possible hunger, we know about possible rising prices on fuel. And this is a changing picture of the world, and New Zealand will be affected just because it is in the region, and the region might have problems with food, and because New Zealand needs to ride the cars. The whole situation, for example, in Germany, now sort of drives the much more serious debate about how to move towards the new ways of energy supplies, sustainable energy. We all talked about it in the light of the climate change, but it is what it is. People sometimes are slow in action, and suddenly it is into people's faces. So I think in a strange way, we will have to start answering difficult questions faster, and because of the war in Ukraine.
Jim, any comments on this?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with that. And of course, coming on the heels of and still developing COVID crisis, that we raise similar sort of issues. So it's hard to disentangle them, but both of them kind of show the interconnectedness, but also the vulnerability that goes with that at the supply chain. So I think there is some realization of that on the New Zealand side, and a wider kind of realization about particularly relations with China and economic interrelations with it. I'm also recently back from Europe, and it was interesting in Germany where we had discussions with students about Germany's policy of reliance on gas imports from Russia. And I said, well, Chancellor Merkel was not a Putin fan. She wasn't pro-Russian. So how did she allow this to happen? And it was partly because Germany benefited economically in that time. But their argument was this kind of belief in interdependence of trade bringing peace. And this seems to have blown that apart. And they're kind of realizing and turning against that. And I think that also applies. I mean, this is turning a bit more away from the kind of economic side, but the geopolitical side about New Zealand's kind of engagement in the global economy and whether that creates vulnerabilities with Russia, but also I think in the longer term with China. But just that point about climate change, yes, there is potentially the positive aspect of this, that European countries in particular may have to act more quickly. In the short term, though, countries like Germany are going back to coal, and Poland is kind of saying, look, we're all right, we're burning coal, which is, of course, is a very bad thing.
Yeah, I think the question that we've had from the audience is a really good one, because I think the Ukraine crisis highlights the gap between the reality of interconnectedness in the world we live, both in economic and trade terms, but the fact that we do not have authoritative international institutions to oversee rules. And I think one of the biggest victims of the Ukraine crisis has been the UN Security Council. And one of the interesting things is that New Zealand has alluded to the fact that President Zelensky said that when this conflict is over, he's going to dedicate himself to reforming the veto system within the UN. And that is something, of course, that's been a long-term goal of New Zealand foreign policy. So I think there is a sense this crisis has highlighted, it's all very well talking about a rules-based order, but you do need institutions to actually uphold the rules. And so, you know, that is something that we probably need to look at in light of this crisis. Now, we have one more question, but we only have 2 minutes left. So there'll be a quick response, I'm afraid. The question is as follows. What do you think about the hypothesis that the war in Ukraine will only be stopped if there is pressure on Russian authorities from its citizens? Is there any realistic component to this expectation? I'll go quickly to Natalia and then quickly to Jim.
As I mentioned in my presentation, at the moment, we are sort of a little bit puzzled by not enough of public pressure on the authorities in Russia. But having said that, there are lots of critical thinking people in Russia, and there are lots of smart people in Russia. And I think that public pressure will come to fruition, maybe a little bit later. We're too interconnected to continue like this, following on the previous sentiment.
Thank you, Natalia. Jim.
And Natalia's point about suffering may in the short term kind of lead people to support the regime. I think in the longer term, potentially, there will be a shift away from it. So I think one of the goals of the sanctions is to achieve that. And I think that's probably right. I think, though, that a more realistic change has to come from the top, from within the elites, within, say, the military or whatever, who sort of see this as not really being in Russian interest and not in the interest of the army necessarily.
Yes, Mr. Putin must be vulnerable to those groups who have traditionally supported his government, because after all, his whole rationale for going into the Ukraine was to strengthen Russia's security situation. Yet he's seen Sweden and Finland now apply to join NATO, which is precisely the scenario he didn't want. So unfortunately, we can't take any more questions because we are rapidly running out of time, but it just remains for me to thank Natalia and Jim for, I think, as you would agree, giving us tremendous insights in this crisis in Ukraine, which has big ramifications and has also been pointed out, big consequences for New Zealand. We may be geographically a long way away, but we're certainly feeling its effects and are likely to in the future as well. So thank you very much for listening. And please keep in mind that we have another Winter Symposium event next week on the 27th of July. Thank you again.